The most expensive mistake a man can make is believing another human being has a price. On a cool October evening in Manhattan, crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across the ballroom of the Blackwood Foundation's annual charity gala, turning polished marble floors into rivers of liquid gold. The city glittered beyond the towering windows, a sea of white lights stretching toward the dark horizon, while the wealthiest names in New York drifted through the room, carrying champagne flutes and conversations worth millions of dollars. At the center of it all stood Nathaniel Brooks. At 39, he was everything the business magazines loved to celebrate. A self-made billionaire, founder of a technology empire, owner of penthouses, private jets, and enough influence to move markets with a single sentence. His tailored black tuxedo fit him perfectly. His confident smile appeared effortless. Yet beneath the polished image lived a man who had stopped believing in surprises years ago. Life had become predictable. Success had become routine. Even admiration felt ordinary. 5 million says you wouldn't last 6 months. One voice suddenly laughed from a nearby table. Nathaniel glanced over. A group of old friends sat in the VIP section overlooking the ballroom. Men who had built fortunes, inherited empires, and spent most of their lives treating the world like a game board. 6 months with who? Nathaniel asked, amused. Another man pointed toward the far side of the room. Her. Nathaniel followed the gesture. Near one of the charity displays stood a woman arranging folders for donors. She wore a simple navy blue dress that looked modest compared to the designer gowns surrounding her. Her dark curls framed a warm face. Her figure was fuller than the beauty standards celebrated by magazines and social media influencers. Yet there was something striking about her presence. She moved with calm confidence, greeting volunteers by name and smiling at guests who barely noticed her existence. Danielle Carter. Nathaniel recognized her from the event briefing. She ran a community education center in Brooklyn that provided tutoring, meals, and after-school programs for children from struggling neighborhoods. The foundation had supported some of her projects before. You mean Danielle Carter? Nathaniel asked. Exactly, one friend replied. A woman like that would never fit into your world. No offense. Laughter circled the table. $5 million says you couldn't marry her and keep the marriage together for 6 months. The words hung in the air. Nathaniel looked toward Danielle again. She was helping a young volunteer fix a crooked display sign, completely unaware that her name had become the subject of a millionaire's joke. 5 million? Nathaniel asked. Cash. Another burst of laughter followed. What's wrong, Nate? Afraid you might lose. For a moment, the city lights reflected in the ballroom windows like distant stars. Then Nathaniel smiled. The same smile that had won negotiations, defeated competitors, and closed billion-dollar deals. You're on, he said. The table erupted. Glasses clinked. Voices cheered. The bet was sealed with handshakes and arrogance. Across the room, Danielle continued speaking with a group of children invited to the gala, kneeling slightly so she could meet them at eye level. Her laughter drifted softly through the noise. Genuine. Unforced. Real. Nathaniel watched her for a second longer than he intended. Then he turned away. To him, it was nothing more than a harmless challenge. A game. A story that would entertain his friends for a few months before everyone moved on. He had no way of knowing that the woman standing beneath the golden lights would soon become the one person capable of changing everything he believed about success, worth, and the true cost of a human heart. 3 days after the gala, a sleek black town car stopped in front of the modest brick building that housed the Carter Community Learning Center in Brooklyn. Children were laughing on the playground behind the building, their voices floating through the crisp autumn air as Danielle Carter carried a box of donated books toward the front entrance. She paused when she noticed the luxury vehicle. People like Nathaniel Brooks did not visit places like this. At least, not without cameras. The rear door opened, and Nathaniel stepped onto the sidewalk in a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than the center's monthly utility bill. For a brief moment, their worlds seemed impossibly far apart. Danielle adjusted the box in her arms and continued walking. Can I help you? She asked calmly. Nathaniel studied her. Without the ballroom lights and designer decorations, she somehow seemed even more confident. There was no effort to impress anyone. No performance. Just quiet certainty. I would like to speak with you, he said. Danielle glanced toward the building. About a donation? Not exactly. A flicker of caution crossed her face. Then you have about 5 minutes. Nathaniel was not accustomed to being given time limits. Yet he found himself following her inside. The center was alive with activity. Teenagers worked on homework assignments. Volunteers distributed snacks. Colorful artwork covered the walls. Every corner reflected care rather than wealth. Danielle led him into a small office overlooking the gymnasium. The furniture was simple. The desk was covered with paperwork. A photograph of smiling children stood beside a stack of grant applications. "So," she said, sitting down, "what brings a billionaire to Brooklyn on a Wednesday afternoon?" Nathaniel remained standing. For the first time in years, he found himself choosing his words carefully. "I have a proposal." Danielle smiled faintly. "That sounds dangerous already." "A marriage proposal." Silence filled the office. Somewhere outside, a basketball bounced against the gym floor. Danielle stared at him as though waiting for the punchline. None came. "You are serious," she finally said. "Completely." She leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "Mr. Brooks, we have spoken exactly twice in our lives. I am aware of that. And your solution is marriage? A temporary arrangement." The words hung between them like cold winter air. Danielle's expression hardened immediately. No, Nathaniel blinked. Most people negotiated with him. Few dismissed him outright. "You have not heard the details." "I do not need the details." She stood and walked toward the window overlooking the playground. Children chased one another across the pavement below. Those kids out there have spent their entire lives being treated like transactions. I built this place so they could believe they are worth more than that. I am not interested in becoming one myself. Nathaniel followed her gaze. For the first time, he noticed how every child who passed the window waved at her. Every single one. "The center is struggling financially," he said quietly. Danielle's shoulders stiffened. "You investigated me." "I researched the organization." She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Of course you did." Nathaniel placed a folder on her desk. Inside were documents outlining a funding package large enough to secure the center's future for years. New classrooms, new technology, scholarships, staff salaries. Danielle looked down at the numbers. Then she slowly closed the folder. "You think this is about money, is it not?" Nathaniel asked. Danielle met his eyes. Her voice remained calm, but something powerful moved beneath the surface. "No, Mr. Brooks. It is about dignity." For the first time since making the bet, Nathaniel felt something unexpected. Not victory, not confidence, resistance. And as he left the center that evening, watching Danielle comfort a frightened child near the entrance, he realized this challenge was going to be far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The first snowfall of the season arrived 2 weeks later, dusting the streets of Brooklyn in a thin layer of white as Danielle unlocked the doors of the community center before sunrise. The building was quiet except for the hum of old heating vents fighting against the November cold. She carried a box of donated winter coats toward the storage room when she noticed a familiar black vehicle parked across the street. Nathaniel Brooks had returned. Danielle closed her eyes briefly before continuing inside. By 8 o'clock, the center was alive again. Children filled the hallways. Volunteers prepared breakfast. Teachers organized classrooms. And somehow, despite every reasonable expectation, Nathaniel was still there. Not in a tailored suit this time. Not surrounded by assistants or photographers. He stood awkwardly, near a supply table wearing a dark sweater and jeans, looking completely out of place among stacks of crayons and construction paper. "You are persistent," Danielle said as she approached. "That is one word for it. Most billionaires would have given up by now." Nathaniel glanced around the bustling room. Most billionaires have never been told no. Danielle almost smiled but quickly looked away. She was not interested in finding him charming. Unfortunately, he seemed determined to make that difficult. Over the next several days, he continued appearing without warning. Sometimes he delivered supplies. Sometimes he helped move furniture. Sometimes he simply sat in the back of classrooms observing the programs he had only read about in reports. The children accepted him far faster than Danielle did. 8-year-old Marcus challenged him to a game of chess and defeated him in 12 moves. 10-year-old Lily informed him that his sweaters were boring and needed more color. Nathaniel listened to both with surprising patience. One afternoon, Danielle found him kneeling beside a table helping a group of students assemble science projects. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching tiny dust particles that floated through the air like gold flecks. The children laughed as Nathaniel struggled to follow instructions written by fourth graders. For a moment, Danielle saw something she had not expected. Not a billionaire, not a powerful executive, just a man trying very hard not to disappoint a room full of children. "You are doing that wrong," she said. Nathaniel looked up. "I suspected that." She adjusted one of the project pieces. Their hands briefly touched. Nothing dramatic happened. No grand realization. Yet something shifted in the silence that followed. "Why are you really here?" Danielle asked quietly. Nathaniel considered the question. The easy answer would have been the proposal, the arrangement, the challenge he had accepted. But standing there beneath colorful paper decorations made by children, those reasons suddenly felt shallow. "I do not know anymore," he admitted. Danielle studied him carefully. She had spent years learning how to read people. Most wore masks. Some wore entire costumes. Nathaniel Brooks seemed to be carrying both. Before she could respond, a young volunteer rushed into the room carrying a stack of unopened mail. Danielle sorted through the envelopes automatically until one caught her attention. Her expression changed instantly. The warmth disappeared from her eyes. "What is it?" Nathaniel asked. Danielle stared at the letter. The city had officially denied the center's expansion permit. Without the approval, hundreds of children on the waiting list would never receive services. The dream she had spent years building suddenly felt fragile. Outside the windows, snow continued falling over Brooklyn. Inside, Danielle folded the letter slowly and slipped it into her pocket. She did not realize Nathaniel had already seen the determination hidden behind her disappointment. And for the first time, he found himself wanting to help her not because of a proposal, not because of a challenge, but because watching her lose felt strangely unbearable. The denial letter should have ended the conversation. It should have been another disappointment filed away beside years of obstacles and impossible budgets. Instead, it became the beginning of something neither Danielle nor Nathaniel expected. The following week arrived wrapped in gray skies and freezing rain. Brooklyn streets glistened beneath streetlights as parents hurried children home before the weather worsened. Inside the community center, however, warmth still lived in every classroom. Danielle moved through the building checking attendance sheets, answering questions, and comforting worried parents who had heard rumors about the failed expansion project. She smiled for them all. She always did. Yet exhaustion lingered behind her eyes. Nathaniel noticed it immediately. He had begun stopping by almost every day, telling himself he was only observing operations. The truth felt more complicated with each passing visit. One evening, long after the last volunteer had left, a frantic knock echoed through the hallway. Danielle opened the door to find a young mother holding her son close. The boy, no older than 9, looked frightened and overwhelmed. Their apartment building had suffered a heating failure during the coldest night of the season. They had nowhere warm to go until morning. Without hesitation, Danielle unlocked additional rooms, gathered blankets from storage, prepared hot chocolate, and called other volunteers for assistance. Within 2 hours, several families facing similar emergencies had arrived. The center transformed into a temporary refuge. Nathaniel watched quietly from the corner of the gymnasium as Danielle moved from family to family. She listened. She reassured. She remembered every child's name. Near midnight, she sat beside a little girl wrapped in a purple blanket and read from a worn storybook beneath the soft glow of a desk lamp. The gymnasium lights had been dimmed, leaving only pools of golden light scattered across the room. Snow tapped gently against the windows. The little girl eventually fell asleep with her head resting against Danielle's shoulder. Nathaniel stood motionless. For years, he had attended charity galas worth millions of dollars. He had signed checks large enough to make headlines. Yet somehow none of it felt as meaningful as this quiet moment unfolding beneath a single lamp in Brooklyn. Danielle looked up and noticed him watching. Neither spoke for several seconds. The silence felt strangely comfortable. "You should go home," she whispered. "You have been here all day." Nathaniel shook his head. "So have you." A faint smile touched her lips. "Somebody has to stay. Then I will stay too." Danielle laughed softly. It was tired but genuine. The sound lingered in the room longer than either expected. Hours later, as dawn painted the windows pale silver, the last family finally settled into temporary accommodations arranged through community contacts. Danielle stepped outside onto the empty sidewalk. Snow covered the city in quiet white layers. The world looked softer somehow. Nathaniel joined her beneath the glow of a street lamp. Both looked exhausted. Neither seemed eager to leave. "You know," he said quietly, "most people would have focused on the permit denial." Danielle slipped her hands into her coat pockets. Children do not stop needing help because paperwork goes wrong. Nathaniel looked at her carefully. The falling snow caught in her dark curls. The city lights reflected in her eyes. For the first time in years, admiration replaced calculation. Respect replaced amusement. And somewhere beneath both, something far more dangerous began to grow. Danielle turned toward the sleeping city, unaware that the man beside her was no longer thinking about a proposal, a challenge, or even a bet. He was beginning to see her the way everyone else in that building already did, as someone extraordinary. December arrived with glittering holiday lights stretched across Manhattan and icy winds sweeping between skyscrapers. From the outside, everything seemed to be moving forward. Nathaniel continued finding reasons to visit Brooklyn. Danielle continued pretending those visits did not matter. The community center had become busier than ever, and thanks to several anonymous donations, programs that were once facing cancellation had survived another season. Yet neither of them knew a storm was already approaching. It began on a Thursday evening inside one of Nathaniel's corporate offices overlooking Central Park. Snow drifted beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows while executives gathered for an end-of-year celebration. Laughter echoed through the private lounge. Crystal glasses reflected the city lights. Nathaniel stood near the window, distracted. For the first time in years, business felt secondary. His thoughts kept returning to Brooklyn, to children who greeted him by name, to a woman whose quiet strength had dismantled assumptions he had carried his entire life. "Look at you," one of his friends joked. The great Nathaniel Brooks actually smiling. The group laughed. Another raised his glass. "I still cannot believe you pulled it off." Nathaniel frowned. "Pulled what off?" "The challenge." The man grinned. "The $5 million challenge. Best bet we ever made." Several heads turned. Someone laughed louder. "You should have seen yourself that night. One look across the ballroom, and you accepted before we even finished explaining the rules." Nathaniel's expression darkened immediately. Enough. But the conversation continued. They had all been drinking. None noticed the woman standing just beyond the partially open doorway. Danielle had arrived unexpectedly to deliver documents related to a youth scholarship initiative Nathaniel's company was sponsoring. His assistant had escorted her upstairs and asked her to wait while Nathaniel finished a meeting. She had never intended to overhear anything. Then she heard her own name. "Honestly," another voice said, "I thought you would give up after a month. Nobody expected you to spend this much time around her." More laughter followed. $5 million well earned. The folder slipped slightly in Danielle's hands. The world seemed to grow strangely quiet. Every memory from the past several weeks replayed itself through a new lens. The proposal, the persistence, the visits, the generosity, the growing trust. One sentence echoed louder than all the others. $5 million. Challenge. Bet. She stood motionless while the truth settled over her like winter ice. Not because it was loud, because it was devastatingly calm. A few moments later, Nathaniel stepped into the hallway and froze. Danielle was standing there beneath the soft golden lights, the scholarship folder held against her chest. Her expression was unreadable. That frightened him more than anger ever could. "Danielle," he said quietly. She looked at him. No tears, no raised voice, no accusation, only disappointment, deep and immeasurable. "Was any of it real?" she asked. Nathaniel opened his mouth, but no answer arrived fast enough. The silence betrayed him. Danielle nodded once. The gesture was small, yet it felt like a door closing forever. She placed the folder on a nearby table. "I spent my life teaching children that their value cannot be measured by money," she said softly. "I should have remembered that lesson myself." Then she removed the small silver key Nathaniel had once given her for unrestricted access to company facilities. She placed it beside the folder. "Goodbye, Nathaniel." He took a step forward. "Please let me explain." Danielle offered a faint smile filled with sadness rather than bitterness. "The worst part is that I finally believed you saw me." She turned and walked away. Nathaniel remained frozen beneath the city lights as the elevator doors closed. And for the first time since that night at the gala, the victory he had once celebrated felt exactly like a loss. Winter passed, then spring, and eventually an entirely different life began to emerge from the ruins of the old one. Danielle Carter disappeared from Nathaniel's world so completely that it felt as though she had stepped beyond the edge of a map. Her phone number changed. Her social media accounts became inactive. Even the community center seemed transformed. New administrators handled daily operations, and whenever Nathaniel attempted to visit, he was politely informed that Danielle was unavailable. At first, he believed time would solve everything. It always had before. Every problem in his life had eventually yielded to persistence, influence, or resources. This one did not. Weeks became months. Months became years. And during those years, something remarkable happened. Danielle stopped surviving and started building. On a bright May morning 3 years later, thousands of people filled an auditorium in Washington, D.C. Cameras lined the walls. National media outlets occupied the front rows. Business leaders, educators, and public officials gathered beneath elegant chandeliers as a massive screen illuminated the stage. At the center appeared a familiar name, Danielle Carter. The audience erupted into applause. She stepped onto the stage wearing an elegant emerald green suit, her natural curls framing a face that radiated confidence and peace. She looked different, not because she had become someone new, but because she had fully become herself. The woman who once struggled to keep a single community center alive now led a nationwide educational foundation serving hundreds of thousands of children across America. Her programs had expanded into dozens of cities. Scholarships carried her name. Universities invited her to speak. Major publications called her one of the most influential voices in education reform. Yet what impressed people most was not her success. It was her authenticity. She spoke the same way she always had. She listened the same way she always had. She still remembered names, still answered letters from children, still visited classrooms whenever possible. As applause filled the auditorium, Danielle approached the podium. Golden light reflected across the stage. Every child deserves someone who believes in them before the world does, she said. The room fell silent. Her words carried the quiet power of lived experience. Several hundred miles away in Manhattan, Nathaniel Brooks watched the speech from a television mounted inside his office. The city stretched beyond the windows exactly as it had 3 years earlier. His company had grown larger. His wealth had increased. His influence had expanded internationally. Yet none of those victories felt meaningful anymore. The office seemed too large. The skyline seemed too distant. Even success felt strangely hollow. He watched Danielle smile as the audience rose to its feet. Pride filled their faces. Admiration. Respect. Everything he had once failed to understand. A framed photograph still sat inside his desk drawer. It showed a crowded gymnasium in Brooklyn, children holding handmade science projects while Danielle stood in the center laughing. Nathaniel had never been able to throw it away. On the television screen, a reporter introduced Danielle as one of the most admired women in America. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. 3 years ago, he had believed he was rescuing her future. The truth was far more painful. She had never needed saving. She had only needed space to rise. And now the entire country was witnessing what he had recognized too late. As the standing ovation continued, Nathaniel stared at the screen and understood something that no amount of money could change. The woman who once trusted him had become extraordinary in the eyes of the world. And he was the man who had taught her never to trust him again. Summer sunlight poured across Manhattan in brilliant sheets of gold, but Nathaniel Brooks barely noticed. His calendar remained filled with acquisitions, board meetings, and international conferences, yet his attention drifted elsewhere. 3 years had passed since Danielle walked out of his life, and still her absence lingered in places success could not reach. There were mornings when he caught himself checking education news before financial reports. There were evenings when he found himself rereading interviews she had given, searching for traces of the woman he once knew in the leader she had become. The realization arrived gradually. It was not a dramatic revelation. It was quieter than that, more painful. Nathaniel had spent years believing regret was simply disappointment about the past. Now he understood regret was waking up every day knowing you had been trusted with something priceless and failed to protect it. One afternoon, while attending a leadership summit in Chicago, he slipped into a breakout session focused on educational innovation. The keynote speaker was a young principal from Detroit whose school had been transformed through grants provided by the Carter Foundation. Nathaniel listened as the principal described renovated classrooms, new technology labs, and scholarships that had changed hundreds of lives. Then photographs appeared on a giant screen. Smiling students, teachers standing proudly beside new facilities, families celebrating graduation ceremonies. In nearly every image, there was evidence of Danielle's work. Not her face, not her name, just the impact she had quietly created. Nathaniel felt something tighten in his chest. Years ago, he had measured success through numbers on quarterly reports. Danielle measured success through lives changed. For the first time, he realized which achievement mattered more. After the presentation ended, he remained seated while the audience filtered out. The empty ballroom seemed enormous. He remembered the community center in Brooklyn, the old desks, the handwritten signs, the children who believed Danielle could solve every problem. Back then, he had admired her. Now he understood he had fallen in love with her long before he was brave enough to admit it. The truth followed him home. It followed him through meetings and flights and sleepless nights overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Eventually, even his closest friends noticed the change. The same men who had once laughed about the bet now avoided mentioning it altogether. The subject had become uncomfortable. Shame had a way of doing that. One evening, Nathaniel opened a drawer in his office and removed a small silver key. Danielle had returned it years earlier. He had kept it ever since. The metal caught the city lights as he turned it slowly between his fingers. Such a simple object, yet it carried the weight of an entire lost future. Outside, the city buzzed with energy. Inside, silence settled across the office. Nathaniel looked toward the skyline and finally accepted what he had spent years resisting. He did not miss Danielle because she had become famous. He did not miss her because she was admired. He missed her because she had seen goodness in him when he had not deserved it. And because he had broken the trust of the one person who believed he could become better than the man he was. As darkness spread across Manhattan, a notification appeared on his phone. The National Education and Community Impact Conference would be held in New York that fall. Danielle Carter was scheduled to deliver the closing address. Nathaniel stared at the announcement for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes. Somewhere between regret and hope, a decision began to form. Because after 3 years of silence, fate was preparing to place them in the same room once again. October returned to New York wrapped in crisp air and amber leaves drifting between glass towers. The National Education and Community Impact Conference occupied the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Grand Hotel, drawing leaders, philanthropists, educators, and journalists from across the country. Long before the closing session began, every seat had been filled. Conversations hummed beneath crystal chandeliers. Cameras waited near the stage. Anticipation lingered in the air. Nathaniel Brooks stood near the back of the ballroom, his hands resting quietly at his sides. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain. Not about business. Not about negotiations. About one woman. 3 years had changed many things, but not the memory of the last time he saw Danielle walking away from him. The lights dimmed. The audience settled. Then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and spoke her name. The reaction was immediate. Hundreds of people rose to their feet. Applause thundered through the ballroom. Nathaniel felt his breath catch as Danielle appeared beneath the spotlight. She crossed the stage with calm confidence, wearing an elegant ivory suit that reflected the warm glow of the lights. Yet it was not her appearance that transformed the room. It was her presence. The same quiet strength he had first noticed in Brooklyn now seemed to fill the entire ballroom. She smiled graciously as the applause continued. Then she began to speak. For 40 minutes, the audience listened without distraction. She spoke about opportunity, about children whose futures changed because someone believed in them, about communities rebuilding hope one classroom at a time. Every word carried authenticity. Every story carried purpose. Nathaniel watched the faces around him. Some people wiped away tears. Others nodded thoughtfully. Many simply stared at Danielle with admiration. By the time she finished, the entire ballroom stood once again. The ovation lasted several minutes. Danielle thanked the audience and stepped away from the podium. As people crowded around the stage hoping to meet her, Nathaniel remained where he was. Part of him wanted to leave. Another part knew he had already spent 3 years running from this moment. Across the ballroom, Danielle accepted congratulations from educators and donors. Then, almost unexpectedly, her eyes lifted above the crowd. For a single moment, they met his. Time seemed to pause. The noise faded into the background. Nathaniel saw recognition, surprise, and then something else. Not anger, not warmth, distance, the kind that only comes after deep disappointment. Danielle held his gaze briefly before turning back to the people surrounding her. The movement was subtle, but it landed harder than any rejection. An hour later, the ballroom had begun to empty. Staff members gathered programs from tables, while guests filtered toward evening receptions. Nathaniel stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the city when he heard familiar footsteps behind him. He turned slowly. Danielle stood several feet away. Manhattan glittered beyond the glass, reflecting thousands of lights across the night sky. Neither spoke immediately. 3 years of silence filled the space between them. Finally, Danielle offered a polite smile. "Congratulations," Nathaniel said quietly. "You built something extraordinary." Danielle looked out toward the skyline. "A lot of people helped build it." Her voice remained calm. "Professional. Careful." Nathaniel nodded. He understood. Trust once broken does not return simply because time has passed. Yet standing beside her again, he realized something important. The woman before him had not merely survived the pain he caused. She had risen beyond it. And as the city lights shimmered below, Nathaniel knew that earning a second chance would require far more than an apology. The conference ended, but the conversation that followed changed everything. Over the next several months, Nathaniel did something he had never done before. He stopped trying to impress Danielle and started trying to become the man she had once believed he could be. There were no grand gestures designed for headlines. No extravagant gifts. No carefully orchestrated surprises. Instead, he listened. Quietly. Consistently. When the Carter Foundation launched a literacy initiative in rural communities, Nathaniel offered logistical support without attaching his name to the project. When schools needed technology upgrades, he helped secure resources through anonymous partnerships. He never asked for recognition. He never asked for forgiveness. And for the first time, Danielle noticed the difference. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after their reunion, Danielle stood outside a newly opened learning center in Philadelphia. Children raced across the playground beneath a sky painted bright blue. Parents toured classrooms. Volunteers handed out books. The building represented another dream realized. As she greeted families near the entrance, she spotted Nathaniel helping a young boy assemble a model rocket beside a picnic table. The sight made her smile before she could stop herself. He looked up and caught the expression. Neither looked away. Later that evening, after the celebration ended, they walked through a nearby park lined with cherry blossom trees. Pink petals drifted through the air like tiny pieces of springtime snow. The city noise felt distant. For a while, neither spoke. They simply walked. Comfortable. Unhurried. Honest. Finally, Nathaniel stopped beside a small fountain illuminated by soft white lights. From inside his coat pocket, he removed a folded piece of paper. Danielle recognized it immediately. It was a copy of the agreement from the challenge that had destroyed everything years ago. The paper had been creased and worn from handling. Nathaniel looked at it for a moment before tearing it in half. Then again, and again. The pieces disappeared into a nearby recycling bin. "That document cost me $5 million, he said quietly. "But losing you cost me something far greater." Danielle studied him carefully. The old Nathaniel would have tried to find the perfect words. The new Nathaniel simply spoke the truth. "I cannot change what happened," he continued. "I cannot erase the pain I caused. But every day since then, I have wished I had met you as the man I am trying to become now." The fountain shimmered behind them. Cherry blossoms drifted between the lights. Danielle felt memories rise and fall like distant waves. The hurt, the disappointment, the years of rebuilding. But she also remembered the children in Brooklyn, the winter shelter, the countless quiet moments when Nathaniel had revealed pieces of the person hidden beneath his mistakes. "Do you know why I finally agreed to talk to you again?" she asked softly. Nathaniel shook his head. Danielle smiled. "Because real change is difficult to fake." Silence settled between them, warm and gentle. Then she reached into her purse and removed a small silver key. The same key she had returned years earlier. Nathaniel stared at it in disbelief. "I think," she said, placing it in his hand, "some doors deserve a second chance." Emotion flickered across his face. Not triumph. Gratitude. The kind earned through growth rather than victory. As evening settled around them, Nathaniel stepped closer. Danielle did not move away. under a sky filled with drifting blossoms and new beginnings. He gently kissed her forehead. She smiled, resting her hand against his. And for the first time, their story was no longer about a bet, a mistake, or a regret. It was about two people who had learned that the strongest foundations are not built with money or power, but with dignity, trust, and the courage to become better than yesterday.